All right, so I'm going to be talking to you today about writing the question 3 essay for the AP literature exam. I call it the question 3 essay because it's pretty much always been the third essay in order on the actual AP exam. When I say that, you can write the essays in whichever order you want. That's just the order they appear in the actual test booklet. Some people also call this the open response essay, and so there's a couple different names, but I'm just calling it the Q3 essay or the question 3 essay. All right, so just a recap on the AP exam itself. You have 3 essays, and you get a total of 2 hours to write all 3. All 3 of these essays are literary analyses. That comes out to 40 minutes apiece if you give equal time for each one, but as we'll talk about today, I suggest that you actually don't do that. In fact, I suggest that you spend less time on this essay and more on the prose and poetry essay. The 3 essays are worth 55% of the total score, which comes out to 18.33% for each essay. So, you really can't just slack off and not do one of the essays without taking a pretty serious hit. Do you have to make a 6 on every essay to do well? No, you don't. But you do want to at least give a decent bona fide effort for each one. And I mean, if you can't really, I would shoot for getting at least a 4 on each one. You could still make a decent score if you do well on multiple choice if you make a 3 on one of them. But if you shoot for doing a 4 on all 3 of them and then doing well on the multiple choice, that'll put you in pretty decent shape to get a good score on the overall AP exam. Okay, so once again, essay 1 is an analysis of a poem or poem section. Essay 2 is an analysis of a prose section. They flipped the order of those two before, but just so whether or not they're 1 or 2, the important thing is you're going to get a prose one and a poetry one. And essay 3 has always been essay 3. That's the one we're talking about today. It's over a longer work of literature, and you choose the work that fits the prompt, and that's the one we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so when you analyze the prompt for the question 3 essay, it can be sometimes helpful to think of it as, I've got 2 questions to answer. I've got to answer the big question of the overall theme, like the big idea that I'm going to address, and the little question of like what devices or what parts of the book, really kind of show that theme. Okay. All right. So I'm going to look at an example prompt here. This is for this is from the 2000 AP Lit exam, and anyway. So many works of literature are not readily identified with the mystery or detective story genre, but nonetheless involve the investigation of a mystery. In these works, the solution to the mystery may be less important than the knowledge gained in the process of its investigation. Choose a novel or play in which one or more of the characters confront a mystery. Then write an essay in which you identify the mystery and explain how the investigation illuminates the meaning of the work as a whole. Do not merely summarize the plot. You see the part I just highlighted yellow? That's the key part of the prompt. They'll usually give you some kind of general statement at the beginning, and then you'll find towards the end of the prompt, you'll find, okay, here's what I really need to zero in on. So here's what we're zeroing in on this one. Identifying the mystery and explaining how the investigation illuminates the meaning of the work as a whole. So we got to identify mystery, explain how investigation, and then we have to tie that to some overall meaning. In other words, we can't just write about how it's important in one scene. We have to tie it to, this plays an important role throughout the book. So you really do have to kind of look at how that goes throughout the whole book. All right, included with the prompt, you'll get a list of books. And this is the and we'll talk about what that means here in just a minute. But here's the list of books for this particular prompt. Okay, so If you're looking at these and saying, wow, I haven't read all of those, or maybe I've only read one or two, well, don't feel too bad. I haven't read all of them either. I've read maybe about half of them, but there's plenty of them that I have not read. So in this particular, out of this particular book here. So yeah. Anyway, so here's the different books in the list that they listed that year. Now, important points when we're looking at this. You do not have to choose a book from the list. You do, however, need to choose a book that's of some literary value. And they actually took that out, that it doesn't have to, we're going to take out the language about it being of literary value. But guys, let's be real here. Don't pick a Harlequin romance. Don't pick, as fun as they are, don't pick the Wimpy Kid series books, Pick something that's got a little bit of heft to it, that's got some meat to it, because you're going to be able to write more about that particular one. So anyway, so pick something that's got a little bit of heft and a little bit of meat to it with some literary quality. And overall, what your task is you need to address how the devices, situations, characters from the work address whatever the prompt topic is. And you have to do that whole connect to the meaning of the work as a whole. Okay? All right, so what do we mean by that word, meaning of the work as a whole? Well, it can be what this book or play is about in particular. Just kind of what's the overall thing being addressed, what you believe the author's trying to say. The main one that we'll look at, however, is this third one, a central theme that drives the work. Okay, just a central message that the book has, if you will. It could be a question, however, that the novel or play evokes. So this is a question that it's addressing. That's could be central to the meaning of the work as a whole. But either way, it needs to be something of that sort, some sort of central core meaning that runs through the whole book. In other words, it's not just dealing with one particular scene or section. All right. So what types of questions do we get for question 3 prompts? Well, we got questions relating to characters or characterization. That's by far the most common. Like I'd say at least half of them fall into that category. Like, talk about a character who is a foil to another character. Talk about a character who conceals things intentionally. Talk about a character who is torn within, has like an internal battle. So those are pretty common ones. Plot structure or narrative situation. The mystery investigation one we just looked at, that's a good example of that. So that's one there. Social issues, sometimes it'll talk about, I think there was one a few years ago about, class differences and how they play into things, play into works and stuff like that. Social setting, kind of an infamous one from a number of years ago was talking about a country setting. And apparently quite a few of the students writing that thought it meant like a different country instead of country as opposed to city. And so like they would write an essay about a book from Kenya or something like that. When of course the original meaning was like, okay, set in the country as opposed to the city. But sometimes you do get those setting questions. Effect on the reader. There's one from years ago that's talked about thoughtful laughter. How books that can be both funny but make you think at the same time. But like I said, the most common one by far is that first one. However, you could get any of these types of questions. They're going to be fairly broad and they're going to be kind of vague, which means that you have to be really intentional in making your thesis nice and specific, because if all you do is just answer the prompt without, trying to define the question a little bit down and be a bit more specific with your thesis, you're going to end up writing a fairly vague paper. So you do have to be very intentional about narrowing and defining your topic clearly. Okay. All right, so let's talk about some little questions. We already mentioned that a little bit earlier. So big question overall in Q3 essays is how X shows Y about the meaning of the work as a whole. Usually that's going to be written out in the prompt, usually, like I said, towards the end. So how investigation of a mystery, for that one we looked at earlier, or thoughtful laughter, or a country setting, or something like that. Little question usually is not going to be written out, but think of it as an additional question you've got to answer. What specific elements, characters, scenes, settings show this? A lot of times when you're writing a Q3 essay, you do absolutely need to talk about the meaning of the work as a whole, but it's a good idea to really zero in on, say, one or two exemplary scenes and make that kind of the heart of your essay, and then talk about how these implications, and everything like that flow out from there and all. So that gives you kind of that specificity, but also gives you the ability to address the overall work. So now we're going to look kind of at, okay, you're sitting here in the hot seat. You just got the question, how should I budget my time? What should I be doing? Well, let's spend the first 5 to 10 minutes planning. Identify what the big question is, and then of course the little question is going to be, kind of, okay, what particular scenes do I want to talk about? Stuff like that. Then figure out which book you're going to use. Once again, you can look at that book list that they give you. You can choose a book from that list, but you do not have to choose a book from that list. So if you don't know any of the books from the list, or if you maybe know some of them, but it's been a while and you're kind of fuzzy on them, then maybe pick another book. But it does need to be a book that will address the topic. Okay, then figure out the specific moment, character, setting you're going to focus on. Like I said, you do need that focus where you're going to be explicating maybe a scene or two. And a lot of times the prompt itself is going to ask you to focus on a particular character. Read the prompt very carefully. If it asks you about a character, don't write about two characters. I mean, you mention other characters, but your focus needs to be on one if it's asking about one. All right, so make a little jotted list of what details to include. And then, of course, that leads to your answer to the big question. And I would try to get this done in less than 10 minutes. Probably not less than 5. So somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, get this knocked out, where you got kind of a plan, you've got some details you're going to include, so that way you can start drafting. Because, anyway, so I'll now show you kind of a little bit of an example here. Okay. Many works of literature are not readily identified with the mystery or detective story genre, but nonetheless involve the investigation of a mystery. Okay. All right. Identify the mystery, explain how the investigation. So we already saw this one before. So anyway, big and little questions. How does the investigation of the mystery illuminate the meaning of the work of the whole as a whole? Little questions, specific things. Okay, so for this example, for this kind of little sample analysis, I'm picking The Great Gatsby, okay, about this idea of a mystery. Okay, so what is the specific moment, character, or setting we're focusing on? Well, there's that scene where Gatsby basically tells Nick his real background, okay? Because obviously the big overall mystery is, who is Gatsby? And that's the really key scene when we find out who he really is. So what are some other details to include? His name change. Okay, his name is actually Jay Gatz. He changed it to James Gatsby. Connection to Meyer Wolfsheim and Dan Cody. These two characters that Wolfsheim, this kind of shady underworld character, and Dan Cody is the famous guy that he helps out and tries to kind of get his leg up into high society. And then obviously at the very end, you probably want to talk about how all this mystery, and he seemed this fascinating guy, but almost nobody showed up for his funeral. So here we go. What does it say about the meaning of the work as a whole? This would be more or less the thesis of the essay. The disappointing revelation of Gatsby's secret identity shows the emptiness of a superficial life through the ultimate pointlessness of Gatsby's heroic effort at self-fashioning. Now, obviously, I had some time to think that through, and it may not come out sounding so polished and fancy, but you need to do something kind of like that. Like, okay, here's what this investigation and the discoveries, here's how they tie into a big overall theme. A big overall theme of Gatsby obviously is a lot of shallow people doing shallow and silly things and, giving their lives to big nothings in a lot of ways. So anyway, all right, so there's kind of a sample initial plan, and then you go into drafting. And I'm not going to draft a whole paper right here, but I'm going to give you some pointers. Okay, so you do not need to include direct quotations. So it's not like you need to have this whole library of direct quotations. If you can think of one, then sure, go ahead, throw it in there. Obviously, you won't be able to cite it per se, like say page number or something, unless you just happen to know that too. But don't worry about that. Just if you want to put a direct quotation in because you remember one and it applies, go for it. But you don't have to. You do need to include evidence, which is mostly going to be paraphrase, summary, plot points, that sort of thing, like talking about stuff that happened in there. However, don't just summarize the plot. Your whole paper can't just be, here's everything that happens in The Great Gatsby, because you're arguing for a thesis. You're trying to make an argument. This plot summary and the things that happen are evidence for your argument. They are not just something you're doing for their own sake, okay? At the very end, time yourself, leave a few minutes to go back over the paper and fix any errors. And here's a suggestion here. You can follow this or not on the AP exam, but my suggestion is start with the question 3 essay. Write that one first of all and try to get it done in 30 minutes, the whole thing. Planning, writing, everything like that. I know that sounds like you're cutting it a little close, but this one really doesn't take as much time to write a decent essay as the prose or the poetry one, because you don't have the added thing of needing to read and analyze a prose chunk, or which can sometimes be pretty long and detailed, or a poem, which could be kind of a difficult poem. You're just going off of something that you've presumably already read and analyzed. And by the way, we are going to be doing some prep in class leading up to the AP exam that will help you to remember and kind of refresh on some older works of literature that you've read before this year, as well as, the ones that are still hopefully kind of fresh in your mind from this year as well also. Anyway, and that kind of pretty much wraps up what you need to do for the Q3 essay. Important takeaways, remember, you do not have to use a book from the list, but you do need to choose a book that's got some decent quality that will address the question. You need to spend some time thinking about, focus points, like what you're going to focus in on, but you do need to also address the overall work. And try to get to drafting, in 5 minutes, if you can, certainly no more than 10 minutes before you get to drafting, okay? And like I said, I suggest that you write this one first and try to keep the whole drafting process, the whole writing process within 30 minutes. Okay. Well, that's all I have for you today. We'll talk about this more in class as it comes up, and we'll obviously be doing some Q3 essays and such. So talk to you later, and goodbye.